Hello, BookTube. Well, it's day 8 of Nonfiction November. That's an event created and hosted by Gemma at Nonfic Books and Olive at a Book Olive, in which they urge you to read more nonfiction. To read some if you read none, to read more if you read some. To give it a try, to branch out. They came up with 4 very broad category challenges that will help you to give structure to reading if you need it, but really the point is the reading. Uh, and I'm wholeheartedly on board, maybe a little more on board than they wish I were. So I've been making recommendations all month of canonical works of nonfiction that you may have heard about or encountered at school, and urging you to give them a second try. Nonfiction November is a perfect time to do that, because these are living works. Uh, if you give them a chance, if you do the minimal grounding necessary to approach them on their own terms, they'll speak to you, and the things they'll say will be valuable, more valuable, in my opinion, than what fiction can do. Uh, but today, today is election day here in the United States. uh, People are voting, the polls are open, uh, and it just so happens by random chance that this is also the second day of a triptych of Renaissance works that I wanted to talk about, that I want to recommend to you. And I swear, weeks ago, the second of these recommendations was always going to be The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, uh, which is an instruction manual, a handbook of his on teaching a hypothetical prince how to rule. I couldn't have picked, I don't think, aside from maybe Mein Kampf, a better book to commemorate today. That wasn't my intention, uh, but it does underscore something, and unfortunately, it underscores something that's more prevalent, more closer to the surface in this election than has ever been true since the American Civil War, and that is the question of responsible authority and the relation to responsible authority of people who have none, which is always going to be the bulk of the people who are ruled by anyone, oligarchy, Congress, a prince. There's always going to be more ruled than rulers. And that fact actually gave rise to the genre of which The Prince is by far the most famous example today. And that was a mirror for princes in Caridians, the instruction manuals for princes, done by usually courtiers or leading intellectuals, people who thought they had a say, people who thought maybe they would be listened to. And in The Prince, which I believe is an incredibly misunderstood book, probably the most misunderstood book in the history of the world. In The Prince, Machiavelli tries to lay out ways in which a prince should rule, things that he should think about, factors that should weigh on him, and factors that he should ignore for the good of his people. And he isn't talking about all princes, and he's not talking about all rulers either. His book doesn't talk about much about republican rule, where not Republican in the American sense of hating black people, but Republican in the ancient sense of representative government that doesn't have one person at its front. It has a group of people who may or may not have some kind of electoral backing behind them. Quite a few city-states in Machiavelli's day in the Renaissance were republics. They didn't have a single prince, so he isn't really talking to them. And there's also another kind of principality that he's not mainly talking to in The Prince, and that's principalities that have settled successions, principalities that have been in the same ruling family for generations, and the people know it, and the people like it, and the work has been successful, and the heirs are established, and there's a structure in place to teach them their job. And they also have the instructive example of their parents, either what to be or what not to be. He's not really talking to them either. There's no point in giving instruction to such a prince. The whole mechanism of the state exists to give that prince instruction. No, he's talking about something else, something a little closer to 2016 in America. He's talking to a new prince, a prince who, through one way or another, has established power over people who don't know him. And now has to rule. And the book is thrilling when you look at it that way. Because the thing to remember, I'm sure, unlike virtually all of the books that I will mention in the month of November, I'm sure that you've all encountered The Prince at some way. At school, probably you were forced to read it. It has all the hallmarks of a school classic. The main one being it's short. So you may have encountered it, but the thrilling thing about it is how much was at stake with books like this. The Prince is not by a wide margin the only book we have like this. It's not even, technically speaking, the only book of its kind that Machiavelli himself wrote, and everyone else did it. It was a going thing, especially if you could get a prince to acknowledge, or get one of his major domos to acknowledge that he knew about it, or maybe had read it. That could hit you in sales. That part's no different than today. But the thrilling thing about it is that these princes held real power. So you wanted them to be good. You wanted them to be temperate and virtuous. You wanted them to study what they were doing. You wanted them to read about their craft. You wanted to urge them to do that, not for theoretical reasons, but because it would affect you directly. If they were unhinged or illiterate, they would plunge your city into war. And war is the end of everything, as people used to say in Machiavelli's day. War is the end of everything. War is the cancellation of gravity, and the annexation of sunlight, and the end of the world. You don't know if you'll live through it. And that America in the 21st century has done a horrifying job of removing those understandings of war. America has been at war for a long time now, and most Americans haven't felt the single slightest touch of it. And if they don't feel it, they don't fear it. And if they don't fear it, they'll authorize it. So, and if they keep authorizing it, their ability to authorize it will slowly be leached away from them. It will simply become part of the state. That's all very dangerous. And in Machiavelli's day, that wasn't true. A prince could take your city to war. And if he did, you would die. And even if you didn't die, your trade would die. And your house would be annexed. And you would be on the road, walking in the dirt with your family and nothing else. Or you'd be branded or castrated. It was a big deal. It was very immediate. And hence the desire of people like Machiavelli, he worked in government his whole life, and most of it at the upper echelons of government, doing courier work, drafting memos, drafting documents, doing rules. He knew what he was doing, and he knew a lot of people who knew what they were doing. It was the beginning of a ruling class of bureaucrats, people who could keep the machinery going perfectly fine without the prince and his cronies. But the prince and his cronies still hold ultimate power, so you want them to be people you can work with. You'd like them to be people you can believe in. That was the goal of the prince. It has been maligned in successive centuries as the handbook of amorality. It's a blueprint for schemers. I don't understand that. I think that Machiavelli would have blanched in horror if he'd known that his name was going to become an adjective, a Machiavel, a Machiavellian. If he'd known that and known what it was going to mean, he would have been terrified at the power of history to misunderstand very clear prose. He didn't even write his book in Latin. He wrote it so that it could be clear. And yet it has been drastically misunderstood and misused by virtually every tyrant who's ever heard about it. But I thought I want to recommend it today because it's a really good book. It's one of the rare instances of a really good reading experience that's also volcanically important. It has had such a huge effect on the world. We'll be getting to one of those later on in about a week. Another example of those, much shorter even than The Prince, and if anything, much more volcanic. But in underscoring the fact that this was a living document, I mean, literally, so it passed around for a long time after Machiavelli wrote it. It passed around for a long time in manuscripts. You would ride into, Avignon or Salisbury or wherever, and it's all anybody would be talking about. And there was no book yet. There were just manuscript copies. And you would want to know if you could get one, and you would ask around, so and so, the prebendary at the latest church, at the local church, I hear he's a book person. Does he maybe have a copy? Can he maybe get me a copy? I've heard so much about this, and you would encounter fake copies. 2, the book wasn't actually published until a few years after Machiavelli died in 1527. So there wasn't a book you could actually go to the stall and buy, but it did exist, and it was a living thing. And the thought experiment that I want to give you to underscore, to show you how it was a living thing and why it was so important, would be to imagine the present day. I very much don't want to imagine. I don't want to use as an example the American election that's taking place right now. Not only because it's so depressing, but also because the founding fathers of America set up a system that is in its nature designed to prevent the kind of princes that Machiavelli was writing about and thinking about. We have some version of checks and balances. We have a hugely ingrained system of people wanting their own goals. The mechanism isn't really conducive to subsuming itself in the will of one individual, to put it mildly. So I don't want to use that as an example. What I'd rather use as an example, just as a thought experiment, is the UK. Quite a few of you live in the UK. I get emails all the time. It's wonderful. Imagine if the Windsors held power. Imagine if they not only held power, but were power, so that they dispensed titles, they dispensed work contracts, they dispensed war contracts. If you wanted to pass a referendum to increase governmental safeguards on water purity, the government was the Windsors, and they had to agree to do it. And by they, I mean the person on the throne had to agree to do it. Otherwise, it wouldn't get done. Imagine if they had that power. For 1,000 years, their predecessors in London did have that kind of power. So it's not as outlandish a thought experiment as it might be in other places. Imagine if the Queen, for instance, had that power. Now, take the thought experiment one step further here, a couple of steps further. The Queen has an heir, Prince Charles. He's older than dirt. he's, in my opinion, an extremely responsible public servant and an extremely responsible royal in the mold that the Windsors largely created and haven't always lived up to. But I don't think there's any chance at all that he's going to come to the throne. He'll be 90. No one comes to the throne when they're 90. I firmly believe he's a vain man, and he knows his place in history. But even so, I firmly believe that he will come to the throne and then abdicate in favor of his son. So let's imagine that he did that, and that everybody knows it. Or let's imagine a hypothetical in which Prince Charles isn't there, and in which Queen Elizabeth II married when she was 20, had an heir. He died. She dispensed with her husband and got another one, and now has a young heir, has an heir who's 30, even though she's 170. One way or another, let's imagine that a young prince is about to come to the throne. She's an old woman. It's possible. That, in the past, in Machiavelli's day, that would have prompted handbooks for princes. From leading luminaries and churchmen, they would have written things hoping the prince would read it and feel morally instructed, because everything was on the line. You had a monarch who was steady, sure, smart, involved, but they can't live forever. And when that monarch goes, the heir takes over, and you want, most of all, a continuation of steady, smart, involved. You want a steady state. All human society wants a steady state. But you're not sure that you'll get it, and so you want to help the prince to be that way. Now, the thought experiment really comes home if you imagine that the succession is due any time. Queen Elizabeth II, God bless her, is old. Imagine if you knew that, and you knew that she couldn't live forever, and imagine that her successor wasn't Prince William, but was Prince Harry. Keeping in mind here what the premise of the thought experiment, which is that he has all the power over your life that anyone can have. Real power. If he decides that you go to war, you go to war. If he decides that you are out of work, you are out of work. If he decides you go to jail, you go to jail and you don't get out. Imagine that he was this close to getting that kind of power. That was Machiavelli's world. Where, where the prince who could inherit power had naked Las Vegas dick pics. had gone to a Halloween party with a Nazi armband on his arm, and who does charity work, but does it blitzingly hungover. and who has been known to make one or another boneheaded public pronouncements. You're not sure of his temperament, in other words. You're not sure how involved he is. You're not sure how smart he is. And you want to be sure. You want to do your part to tell him what to do, to show him the good way to rule. That was the world in which Machiavelli wrote. And that genre doesn't really exist anymore. The genre of Mirror for Princes doesn't really exist anymore, in my opinion. It morphed into most of the books that you see. If you go into the bookstore and you go to the political science section and you see books about, what we should do with Iran, the Iran nuclear deal, our corrupt healthcare system and how it's killing us all, that sort of thing, they masquerade as Jeremiah ads. But I think those books are really mirrors for princes. I think every one of those authors is hoping that President Obama will pick up their book and read it. Some of them are even explicitly pitched that way. Here's a letter to the next president, that sort of thing. I think those books morphed into that section, even in America, where there are checks and balances, where the prince doesn't have complete power. So that's sorry for the long digression here. The impression that you might be getting about these recommendation videos, which is that I could talk about any of these books for 2 hours without stop, is absolutely true. So I'm fighting against that the whole time. So pardon the digression, but that is my recommendation for today. I strongly recommend The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, and I recommend it especially if you've already read it for school. If you read it with a gun to your head under deadline and I had a 2-page compare and contrast paper due on it or some nonsense like that, read it again as a living work. Read it again with the knowledge in mind that these settled, secure, grounded governmental systems that I would say most of us watching this channel have and have had our whole lives are a drastic exception. They are not the norm. And these books, The Prince was a book about directly addressing the way it used to be. Some of the bad possibilities of the way it used to be. Read it with that in mind. Read it with active current events in mind. Read it as a living thing, and it'll just jump off the page at you. But that's my recommendation for today, and I'll see you tomorrow, hopefully at less length. The Italian Renaissance, oh my God, it's almost as bad as the Middle Ages when it comes to brevity. I'll try to remember. I'll try to do better tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.